move on to our next two presentations. And I regret we will have to end at 4:30, so we are going to have a bit of a time crunch. So if the two next speakers wouldn't mind to be maybe if you can just curtail your presentation by a few minutes to allow for some dialogue after your presentation, if that's at all possible, that would be great. Because yes, we have a time crunch, and I'm sorry about that. So next up we have Dr. Abraham Weizfeld, who is a lecturer, author, and peace activist, and he will be speaking about apartheid and reciprocity. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Actually, what I would like to do is just make an introduction to my paper, which is more elaborate, and I would give you a copy of the paper, and you can do a more serious treatment of this.
I have one. Why don't you give it to me? I'll have one. I have one. You can get started.
Yes, time's of the essence.
It's an addition.
Oh, okay, who was just going this way? I think you did right there. Nice,
I've published my thesis on the subject, and this paper is actually an elaboration, an extrapolation of my thesis in terms of the implementation of the principles that I refer to here. This topic is rather difficult, and I'd like to refer to two examples which point to the difficulties involved. Currently, everyone knows of the negotiations that were attempted by John Kerry on behalf of the American State Department between Israel and the Palestinians, specifically between Israel and the Palestine Authority, being the Palestine Authority specifically led by the Fatah Party and by Mahmoud Abbas acting as Prime Minister. And all of the points of contention were addressed in a prolonged period of time, which were resolved to one degree or another until one particular question came up for discussion, which was a point raised at the very end of the negotiations by Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, which was the insistence upon the recognition of Israel as a Jewish nation state. Now, it seems like a very abstract concept, which just is composed of a number of words which have little, if any, relevance, and yet it is the point that caused the negotiations to actually break down. Mahmoud Abbas refused to recognize Israel as a nation state, in spite of previous references on his part, saying that, well, it's not up to us, the Palestinians, to define the nature of the state of Israel. If Israel wants to define itself in a particular way, then Israel can go and do what it wants, because the Palestinians have no power over Israel to prevent Israel from deciding on its own what it considers itself to be. However, that statement was not sufficient. And Benjamin Netanyahu continued to insist that the Palestinians had to recognize Israel as a Jewish nation state. Why? Secondly, my thesis, which was deposited with all of its modifications and that were insisted upon by some members of my jury, was deposited in 2005. Immediately afterwards, I didn't receive a defense hearing at all. In fact, because of the insistence of one member of my jury, my thesis was expelled from the Department of Political Science of the Université de Québec à Montréal, which is unprecedented, and of course contrary to the regulations of the university itself. 4 years later, in the Quebec Superior Court, the Juge Gauthier declared that indeed the regulations had been violated, and that like a thesis has a right to a defense. And Why? Why did that happen? Okay. This thesis is a critique of the concept of the nation state, specifically the nation state of Israel, beginning from a critique of the concept of the nation state as proposed by Hegel. Now,
It's not even proposed by who?
Hegel,
Oh, yes, Hegel, yes.
which nobody reads anymore,
Well, they can read, then you.
except for me.
I don't think they can.
Fortunately, because my mother tongue is Yiddish, I was able to read the relevant passages in the original as well, to understand exactly what this guy was getting at. Now, so I think I'm well qualified to discuss the reasons why the negotiations broke down, with the state of Israel there. Frustrating, the American State Department enormously, because they had actually agreed to recognize Israel as a Jewish nation state in order to cultivate, a certain political relationship with Israel, in order to induce a certain compromise on its part, so that the possibility of the suspension or the end of the continued, territorial expansion of the state of Israel into the occupied Palestinian territories could be secured in order to achieve a two-state solution with a minor sort of exchange of territorial concessions, with the settlement blocks, so-called, being ceded to Israel in exchange for territories from Israel being ceded to the Palestine Authority in exchange, which was conceivable, possible, and actually agreed to in previous negotiations, specifically those that had taken place previously in the Taba agreement, so-called, which was a subsequent agreement, to the Oslo interim negotiations that were concluded in 1992, I think, not long ago. Now, the reason why the Oslo agreement broke down is because of this concept of the nation state. Now, there's two reasons why the concept of nation state is not operable when applied to Israel. First of all, it would mean that the Palestinians would have to give up in permanence any collective national rights within the context of the state of Israel itself, which would mean that the 20-25% of the population of Israel that are Palestinians, Druze, or Bedouin would no longer have any collective rights, and consequently would be subjected to the majority legal rights enforced under the concept of the Jewish nation-state concept, which would mean that even their individual rights could be annulled, and even their homes could be destroyed because they did not receive a permit, because permits were only for construction were only granted to those who were compliant with the priorities of a Jewish nation-state concept. So it goes enormously into even the level of individual civil rights, and even those civil rights for citizens, recognized citizens of the State of Israel. So it was a non-operational from that point of view. Secondly, it annulled the concept of the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, which is the largest refugee population in the world and in human history, and even has its own UN agency which takes care of this population, which amounts to between 5 and 7 million people around the world, and concentrated in a number of different countries such as Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, resulting in their subsequent destabilization and in the suppression of the Palestinian population of those countries as well, who are not entitled in many cases, either to a vote or to any recourse to higher education, because they are barred from such occupations in the professions such as doctors, professors, and other sort of liberal arts. So the concept, hits a number of different areas. There is another area which is not very well known, which this concept of the Jewish nation state, affects, which is the Jewish people itself. Because, Israel has not actually passed a law declaring itself to be a Jewish nation state, in spite of the fact that the Prime Minister Netanyahu refers to the Jewish nation state in his presentations to the United Nations General Assembly. And when the Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman actually attempted to propose a resolution in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, to declare Israel to be a Jewish nation state, even the Prime Minister Netanyahu refused to endorse this resolution and it was tabled. Why? Because, consider this, if Israel were to be considered a Jewish nation state, then the Jewish people, considered to be a nation subsequently by this concept, would have to be entitled to equal rights with any other Jewish person in the world, which would mean a Jewish person living in Israel with the rights of a citizen and with the right to vote in the Israeli elections. So that would mean that the Jewish people internationally, who are in their majority living outside of the state of Israel, would have to be entitled to a vote. Otherwise, Israel would become a Jewish dictatorship and not a Jewish democracy, by definition. Very problematic concept. Now, these, what I call the Zionist state of Israel, cannot allow for the Jewish people internationally to have a vote in the Israeli elections because they could easily vote to end the occupation of the Palestinian territories, because as it so happens, a majority of the Jewish people internationally are opposed to the occupation of the Palestinian territories, even though they're sympathetic, with the Israeli population and even with the state of Israel, but they are not sympathetic with the continued occupation of Palestinian territories since the war of 1967. Because it contradicts the liberal values that they have been inculcated with, living in the United States of America or Canada, whatever, and because they find it embarrassing, politically embarrassing, to have the state of Israel associated with such what they consider to be detrimental, political activities, which reflect upon the Jewish people as a whole, because Israel is identified with the Jewish people, etc. And so it engenders an objective basis for the propagation of anti-Semitic hatred against the Jewish people as a result, which has been the case, not only amongst the Palestinians and the Arab populations of the world and the Islamic populations of the world, which give credence to such publications even as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which claim a Jewish conspiracy to take control of the world. And yet, Israel does not take this problematic into consideration, because for them it is not a problem for Israel, because the Jewish population of Israel is not living in the international context, it is only living in the Israeli context, and so anti-Semitism internationally does not become a political issue inside Israel. It is only a political issue for those majority of the Jewish people living outside of Israel. So you can see the dimensions of surrounding this, just this one concept. Now, I'd like to just make some references to my actual paper here, briefly, so that we can have more extensive discussion, because I'm sure there's many questions. Now, the nature of things is that the Zionist mentality amongst the Jewish population of what I call Palestine, actually, appears to justify the apartheid character of the occupation by the Jewish people having endured the second-class minority status themselves prior in history, and within the Ottoman Empire itself, living as what was called a dimini status, in which they were a tolerated minority, having to pay a special tax for the protection of the empire. So if that tradition was considered to be normalization of a social existence, even the Sephardim, the Arab Jews, and the survivors, of the European Jewish population, consider that the second-class citizenship status of the Palestinians, Bedouins, and Druze populations of Israel is, considered to be an irrelevant political issue, because they consider it to be the normal state of affairs in international relations. Now, that is how this nature of this particular form of apartheid has come to be. The formation of the Zionist ideology itself is a latter-day manifestation of the rise of the nation-state concept during the period of the Reformation, when each national society began to take measure of itself and decided that they no longer wished to be a component province within what was called the Holy Roman Empire. Okay? So each national society developed its own religious expression, which gave rise to subsequent political independence, or in effect, rationalized the political independence of that given society according to a religious criteria, which was, remained a very powerful political force. So that in Germany we had Lutheranism, in Holland it was Calvinism, in England it was Anglicanism, and so Zionism came to be as a pseudo-religious expression of a national identity in order to justify the establishment of a nation state as other European nation states were established, in the Reformation period. However, 150 years, late. And in a period when the nation state itself began to erode and began to implode as well. For instance, we see, like in a case such as Belgium, where you have two national entities vying for majority control over the country, and which actually resulted in a state without a government for a period of about a year because they couldn't resolve that contradiction. Europe itself has, decided that, the sovereign nation state is a obsolete phenomenon which has to be surpassed by the federation of the European Union, to the extent that it has been possible to establish this federation based upon the underlying structure of the nation state, which continues to persist. And so the contradiction exists, but nonetheless, the need to surpass that contradiction exists at the same time in order to preserve, social peace, continental peace. So you have these attempts to go beyond the nation state, while in the case of Israel, you have the propagation of a nation state and the elaboration of a nation state, and even the proposition to codify a nation state. Even at this very moment, there are bills before the Knesset, of Israel, which seek to define the religious character of the state to a greater and greater extent. Now, this problematic was recognized when President Truman of the United States recognized the state of Israel in his letter of recognition here, which you can find inside the document that I gave you, which is a reproduction of his letter, in which Harry Truman, with his own hand, crossed out the words Jewish state and wrote in the state of Israel, recognizing that there's going to be a problem with the indigenous population which remained within the state of Israel, and not willing to engender the animosity of that population together with their other Arab states, which under the dynamic of Pan-Arabism, would identify with the Palestinian population. To recognize Israel as a Jewish state in such a letter would have been very problematic with the relations with every other state in the Middle East, and so he didn't do that. In fact, that there was a reference made in a report to President Truman at the time by Graham Maxwell, which was a joint American-British initiative which investigated the problematic there and actually recommended a binational society to Truman. But he was unable to give voice to that recommendation because of the power of the American Zionist lobby, which is sometimes referred to as a Jewish lobby, mistakenly, but is actually, a lobby representing a very limited segment of the American Jewish population. What else I can refer to that is crucial is, yes. Now, in terms of the resolution of this problematic, I have developed something in a whole chapter that took me in this thesis, called the principle of reciprocity. Now, if we were, which is self-evident, but in order to prove it, requires a certain elaboration. But if we were to implement the principle of reciprocity, it would be possible to do so in this context. Briefly, we would have to have a federation of peoples rather than a nation state. the nation state being problematic, not only in terms of the Jewish context, but also in terms of the Palestinian context, since 20% of the population within the Palestinian territories now are Jewish settlers, so-called settlers, which are there for Zionist and ideological purposes. So it is not possible to separate the populations of this territory. You know, it's a very small territory to begin with, and they are very much, interpenetrated. Therefore, the only resolution that we can see is that of a federation rather than of a state or two states. The two-state solution now has become evidently impassable. There is an impasse now that the American State Department has given up on. Now, the alternative that has been presented by many intellectuals and academics, both amongst the Israeli, Jewish, and Palestinians, has been for a one-state solution with a democratic, secular state, which was the proposal of the Palestine Liberation Organization in the 60s in their initial declaration. However, this is not operational because it is evident if there was equal rights granted to every single, individual residing, within that territory to be recognized as a citizen of itself, then soon enough, majority of the population would become, Arabic, and so the Israeli Jewish population would object to having majority population to which they were subjected to as a minority. Therefore, this was not operable. So we have to go beyond, the citizens' rights to recognize national cultural autonomy in a federation by means of an apparatus which is called a constituent assembly. So that is basically a conclusion that I can arrive at, just briefly, and you can see the elaboration of that in the paper itself. Thank you very much.
Maybe just one quick question before we have our next presentation. How does that sound?
Yes. Yes.
Just not sure I followed it, but let's look. What if it goes like this? I mean, what I don't get is, if there are certain forces in Israel that want Israel to be a Jewish state, but there are other forces in Israel that see that if they became a Jewish state, that might water down their nationalism because expatriates could vote against the occupation of Palestinian territories. Who suggested that?
They haven't even taken this into consideration.
But that was the move against Lieberman, you said.
That was because Netanyahu understood the problematic.
Okay, so Netanyahu alone understands.
Yes.
A few. Okay. Well, then my question would go this way: why wouldn't Abbas agree?
Because it would annul the right of return of the Palestinians, which would get into trouble with his own population.
How would it annul? Because if it leads to the watering down situation?
Because it would mean
then
that
liberals vote the hardliners in Israel out, and move towards the solution of those problems.
well, because there's so many Palestinian refugees, if they did actually return, then they would form a majority of the population, and Israel would no longer be a Jewish nation state.
But that's why Abbas should accept the language that he was being asked to accept, because it would lead ultimately to a Jewish state, which would include the expatriate vote, and the expatriate vote would lead to the solution, and then the Palestinians would end up being the majority of their own state.
No.
Send that email to Abbas. The negotiations are back on.
There are so many Palestinian refugees that it would overwhelm the Israeli Jewish society.
Yeah.
And so, Israel would never agree, to the right of return of the Palestinian refugees, even with expatriate Jewish votes, because a large part of the Jewish expatriate votes would vote in favor of an accommodation with the Palestinian refugees, because it doesn't affect them personally, you see. So they could afford to vote, to allow for a large proportion of the Jewish Palestinian refugees to return without, engendering any personal problem for them.
Yeah.
So there's a contradiction in interest between the Israeli Jewish population and the international Jewish population.
We're out of time.
We are definitely out of time, and I regret that we have to finish, but thank you very much for your presentation. And before will be Peter Benson, and I'll just introduce you while you find your presentation. So he is former economist and senior policy advisor, the Ontario Ministry of Finance, vice president, administration and finance from Wilfrid Laurier University, and bursar, University of St. Michael's College and the University of Toronto, and our esteemed treasurer for the association. So I regret we are quite tight on time, but are you able to get your presentation?
Turned on.
Okay, so while you do that, I'll just let everyone know, Press, McGill Queen's Press has a representative right outside the room and has a variety of books for purchase if anyone's interested in Bob Christmas's book. And the price is $25, I understand. And so he's available to pick those up afterwards.
Okay, I think it's coming. Oh, here we go. Okay. So this, yes, my presentation this afternoon will cover 6 sections of the paper in 6 slides. And I'd like to give you a brief overview of those slides. So the first section defines democracy and describes its principles and purpose. The second slide on capitalism, this section describes the 4 institutions of capitalism, which are private firms, market exchange, monetary system based on bank credit, and a distinctive role for governments in relation to the first 3 institutions. And since there are many different roles the government can play, there are many variations of capitalist systems. The third section discusses democratic capitalism. That's an economic system that's based on and consistent with the principles of democracy. In section 4, the acquisitive class is described. The acquisitive class is one of 4 distinct classes of human societies based on fundamental differences in human nature. It's a class that is most interested in and adept at managing economic systems. So this section outlines how conflicts between the acquisitive class and the other 3 classes over who should dominate the governance of society get resolved over long periods of time. Section 5 analyzes the elements of what I call Canada's present democratic deficit. And in section 6 of the paper, I present proposals for restoring Canada's democracy to health for the purpose of ending the dominance of the acquisitive class. These proposals are, in my view, preconditions for Canadians to begin to adopt a system of what I call democratic capitalism. So, the paper covers 6 aspects of democracy, and I'll comment briefly on each of them. The overall definition is that democracy is a system for organizing human life in society. It involves government by all the people through elected representatives for the benefit of at least a majority of citizens. And it involves the acceptance of the principles of equality of rights, of equal treatment, fraternity, and social justice. The key rationale for democracy is the achievement of what I call the public good. Democracy is also about social contract. In a democracy, people give up individual liberty in exchange for collective benefits. In other words, freedom is not absolute. It competes with citizens' preferences for collective benefits. The flip side of that is the loss of individual freedom is the responsibility of every citizen for the welfare of all citizens. Equality of rights and equal treatment are the key principles of democracy. Every citizen has a right to vote, and every vote is equal. All citizens have equal access to and participate in the legislative process, and all groups, whether religious, cultural, ethnic, or racial, are treated equally. Fraternity means a group joined by common interest or fellowship or ideas, and so it implies the treatment of common people and elites as equals. Social justice is also a key principle that's been referred to in previous presentations to date. Social justice principles are about two aspects of fairness. The first principle is equality of opportunity, that is the opportunity that all should have to participate in economic and social life in society. And the second principle is that inequality of wealth and authority are just only if they result in compensating benefits for everyone, and in particular the least advantaged members of society. The public good is democracy's rationale for purpose. Public good is a collection of society's ends. As these ends are elements, the elements of these are numerous, they are diverse, they are shared, which makes democracy a very complicated business. For example, the elements include the objectives of peace, security, health, balance between individual prosperity, limits on inequality of private wealth and income, balance between work and leisure time for social, cultural, recreational, physical activities and other pursuits, democratic engagement, the level and quality of environmental and ecological resources. They also include the absence of what are called social bads, such as the incidence of crime and family breakdown. Social scientists have constructed indices that aggregate the value of all these elements for of the public good based on surveys of public opinion and other statistical research. Of particular interest in the paper is the comparison of change in the University of Waterloo's Canadian Index of Well-Being since 1994 with the change in per capita GDP. Per capita GDP is viewed as an indicator of success of our capitalist economic system. But since 1994, the overall improvement in well-being in Canada is substantially lower than the increase in per capita GDP. So this gap raises the question of whether the capitalist economic system is democratic. Democracy demands certain responsibilities from the public. And I'd like to add or emphasize that these are responsibilities. They are not a matter of choice. The issue of choice, the theory of choice, is part of consumerism, which is a totally different concept than the concept of democracy. So in a democracy, only the citizens determine the nature of the public good and discuss the choices among the various societal ends that make up the public good. In this respect, they have three responsibilities. One is a duty to vote in elections. Secondly, to engage in discourse with their fellow citizens and elected representatives. And thirdly, to spend time to become informed about issues related to the public good. These are the requirements of good citizenship. And without citizenship, power will be ceded to corporations and their interests. Or as one politician put it, without good citizenship, the whole game is given over to spin doctors. Okay, capitalism. I'm going to rush here. This covers the four institutions of capitalism. Private firms. Private firms are organized for the purpose of producing goods and services, distributing and selling them in exchange for money with the purpose of making profit. The mission of a private firm is to make profit, and this mission may or may not be in the public interest or serve the public good. It's the firm's use of capital along with labor that gives rise to the name capitalism. Profits do not represent returns from hard work. They represent compensation for the owners who risk losing their investment of capital in the firm. Market exchange Markets are places where commodities are exchanged for money prices in the market send signals to both suppliers and potential purchasers. The purpose of market prices is to equalize or balance supply of commodity with the demand so that all that is produced is sold. The resulting prices have nothing to do with intrinsic values of the commodity or the millions of buyers who make up the demand for the market. The extension of market exchange to labor means that the wage rates have no relationship whatsoever to the intrinsic value of labor. Rather, they reflect the principle of scarcity or surplus of labor relative to its demand. The third institution is monetary systems based on bank credit, money. Governments control the money supply and interest rates by controlling policies of central banks and intervene in money and financial markets. Big advantage of central bank policies to set targets. Maximum rates of inflation and interest rates means it provides a lot more security for firms over the likely future value of the money that they typically have for planning the future. Finally, come to the roles of government and coordinating other institutions. The function of government is to coordinate the firms and the markets and the monetary system to achieve certain ends related to the public good. Governments perform this role by assessing the strengths and weaknesses of firms, of markets, the financial sector, and they make decisions to intervene to better achieve the public good. It's a central feature of modern capitalist systems is a symbiotic relationship between government and private firms. The separation of government from the private sector is an economic myth. Democratic capitalism is an economic system that's based upon and consistent with the principles of democracy that I talked about earlier. It's substantially different from the present capitalist system that we have in the United States and Canada in several respects. First of all, with respect to wages. In the democratic capitalist system, wages are based on intrinsic value of human labor, which is based on hours of work, and a wage rate that is roughly equal to the average wage rate in the economy. Wage rates can vary for more skilled workers, in which case there is the amount of time required to acquire the skills. The overall result is a much smaller range of wage rates, and in particular, the elimination of poverty of the working and poor. That is a feature of the present capitalist system. With respect to returns to capital and labor, returns to capital under the present economic system are much higher than they would be under democratic capitalism. At present, our economy is dominated by very large firms engaged in monopolistic competition. They use their market power to set higher prices for customers and restrict investment and build capital in order to realize higher rates of return than would prevail under conditions of greater competition. Secondly, in a democratic society, government taxes are the price of goods and services that governments supply. That is, in aggregate, taxes balance the cost of benefits. The reality of the present capitalist system in Canada and the United States is that governments supply an enormous variety and amount of services to firms. In the golden age of capitalism, in the U.S. and Canada, which ended around 1970, these services were recouped for very high rates of tax on corporations. Today, the same services and more are provided. For example, most of the internet system was developed by government agencies, and governments charge no royalties whatsoever for the private firms that benefit from that massive investment. So today, the same services and more are provided, but tax rates on corporate income have been reduced by 45% in Canada since 1960s. So high profit rate businesses are partly due to the fact that governments undercharge firms for the benefits that they confer. External cost of pollution are another example of what the cost of private firms that are picked up by the government. With respect to distribution of wealth, between 1990 and 2005, corporate profits, pre-tax profits in Canada grew by 321%. employment income grew by 64%. So as a result, there's been an increasing share of profits in national income and stagnant employment income. This result is inconsistent with the second democratic principle of social justice. Given the shortness of time, I'm going to skip comments about land and trade and investment, except to say some of the major trade experts in the United States suggest that it's basically a set of policies to poor Americans and increase profits for corporations. Okay, slide 4. So, the acquisitive class. There are 4 social classes, and this is the work of Indian philosopher D.K. Sarkar. There are warriors. These are the people who try to solve problems with health, might, and muscle, born with, and they tend to be found in occupations involving physical risks: soldiers, policemen, firefighters, professional athletes, skilled blue-collar workers. Then there are the intellectuals who solve problems and attain goals by utilizing their minds, born with relatively superior intellect, found in occupations such as philosophy, writers, scholars, lawyers, physicians, poets, engineers, science, white-collar workers, and priests. Then the inquisitors are primarily interested in amassing wealth and a good life. They are bright. Their minds run mainly after money. They're smarter than warriors, but not as intelligent as the intellectuals. Found in occupations of merchants, bankers, moneylenders, businessmen, and landlords. And finally, the group of physical laborers, they lack the physical vigor of the warrior intellectual. They lack the physical vigor of the warrior, the intellectual, or the accumulating instinct of the inquisitor. They lack the ambition of all the other 3 classes, and consequently they tend to be exploited. The process of social evolution at any one good time, one of these classes dominates the governance of society. And over time, the dominant class becomes corrupt, and the resulting conflicts between it and the other classes is resolved by a change in the dominant class. The theory is that civilization emerges with the rise of the warrior, and after considerable ups and downs through eras, it transfers to the intellectuals, and then the inquisitors, and the physical laborers, and then back again to the warriors. The inquisitor class dominated European societies from the start of the 10th century to the middle of the 14th century. Around 1860, the Industrial Revolution brought the inquisitor class back into dominance. Since the 1930s, it's been in decline in the U.S. and Canada and other countries, owing to decades of political corruption that have resulted in economic chaos and poverty. Brings me to the last 2 slides, Canada's democratic deficit. There are 5 phenomena. The dominance of the inquisitive class in the U.S. and to a lesser extent in Canada has been enabled by a major weakening of Canada's democracy over the last 40 years. There are 5 phenomena associated with this decline. First, citizen disengagement. Up to 70% of citizens are disinterested in or uninformed about public issues. 40% of them don't vote in federal elections, and the percentages are even higher for provincial and local governments. Secondly is the rise of consumerism. There's been a huge increase in advertising of products and services to create wants for new products and more luxury. Estimates are expenditures on traditional and non-traditional advertising now account for 5% of GDP, which works out to about $6,600 annually for every Canadian customer. That's up from the equivalent of about $5,300 in 1970. So since then, consumer credit has been made a lot easier to access. And since the 90s, it's got a lot less expensive. This consumerism affects the mentality of citizens who are focused more on wants than needs, and view taxes as a cost rather than the price of public benefits. And the politicians tend to use the same deceptive techniques as private advertisers do in order to sell their message and brand. Thirdly, we have a rise of conservative propaganda. Several myths about the economy and government have been developed and relentlessly repeated by think tanks and certain segments of commercial media. The characterize government as generally inefficient and rationalize the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few. Examples include statements that tax cuts increase jobs, poor are irresponsible and undeserving, and hard work is what makes people rich. The paper goes into the details on that. Next, we have the corrupt political party. What this means is not the usual corruption that we're thinking about, but there's a shift away from representing the interests of the public to political power for its own sake. And that is a form of corruption. Finally, we have a partially undemocratic electoral system. Canada's first past post-electoral system gives a political government party a majority of seats in the House with a minority of the popular vote. Current Conservative government has a majority of 54% of seats in Parliament, but only 39% of the popular vote. And since many don't vote, it governs with the support of a narrow base of 24% of the electorate. As a result, some of its policies do not reflect the interests or the priorities of the majority of Canadians. So finally, what are we to do about this? The war on the dominance of the acquisitive class is all about restoring Canada's democracy to health by eliminating the democratic deficit. And I have several proposals for that. The first is to adopt compulsory voting. Canadians should support the adoption of compulsory voting along the lines of Australia for all levels of government. We can't have a democracy without Democrats. Presently, the federal government in Canada is missing about 9.2 million Democrats, although voter participation rates just over 61%. It's anticipated that compulsory voting along Australian lines would raise voter participation rates to close to 90%. Secondly, we have to reform the electoral system. Our electoral system needs to be changed to reflect the principle of proportional representation. This will produce more minority governments, thereby reducing the power of the governing party and provide incentives for more collaborative and cooperative initiatives with other parties to pass legislation. Minority governments tend to represent a greater diversity of population that make up the majority of the Canadian electorate. Secondly, next we need a massive change in public education. By definition, democracies do not work with uninformed electorates. A massive refocus of the public education system is proposed. Its emphasis on civics, concepts of collective decision-making, economics, and political science, which are all about collective decision-making and how economic systems should work for the public good. Further, in an ideal democracy, the variations in educational outcomes among socioeconomic classes and regions ought to be minimal in order to reflect the democratic principle of equal opportunity to participate in the democratic process. Next, we need formal training programs for politicians. Politicians need formal education in areas that are relevant to the performance of their roles in Parliament. The first of these roles is passing laws to better coordinate markets and private firms, and non-governmental organizations and citizens and the monetary system to achieve the public good. The second is holding the government to account for the administration of laws and authorization of cost-effective expenditures. Formal training in economics and political science will enable them to lead the public into the discourse on the public good and economic systems that are based on the principles of democracy. Right now, there's less than 1% of the members of the House of Commons that have any formal education in either economics or political science. At the same time, it will enable them to better be guardians of the public good by countering the propaganda of the acquisitive class, or indeed the propaganda of any other class, with rational evidence-based discourse. Fourthly, we need increased financial support for political parties and politicians. Funding of all political parties should be substantially increased to enable politicians to devote more time and energy to promoting discourse about the public good and related issues among citizens. Such funding would counter the huge resources that are now devoted to the promotion and manufacture of material wants. Increased funding should also be democratically distributed through government-promoted subsidies to parties. This proposal is intended to put the political representatives of the less affluent electorate on a more or less level playing field with the political representatives of the more affluent electorate. So I've been emphasizing the public good throughout this. I think it's important, it's so important, and we don't have any political leadership on it. Therefore, I propose that the government of Canada should establish a royal commission on Canada's public good and social progress to engage as many Canadians as possible in that discourse.
So I don't know that when we really have time for questions. Can we entertain one?
Yes, perhaps.
One question.
Your
And
questions someone asked must represent everyone.
exactly, that's great. That would be the way to go forward. And then if your question is not asked by the one representative in the room, perhaps you can continue the conversation afterwards.
All right.
But does anyone have a question?
One quick.
One quick question on behalf of all of us.
Peter, you glossed over land and nature as factors of production. Just say one or two things about
Okay,
that.
we have a huge housing problem in the country, and the reason we have that is we allow private individuals and firms to buy public land. Public land is not private good, it's public good. We have a huge number of millionaires and billionaires who made their money by buying private land and reselling it at huge increase in prices. The increase in those prices has nothing to do with their hard work, it has nothing to do with their innovation. What it has to do with is the population growth in urban centers and the massive municipal infrastructure spending that goes on in those neighborhoods.